For 3 years, Mr. Clark's 3 Dobermans roamed our neighborhood like they owned it. "They're friendly," he'd yell from his porch, beer in hand, while his unleashed dogs cornered another terrified pedestrian. I was walking my 70-year-old father home from our weekly dinner when they charged us. The biggest one knocked Dad to the ground, triggering chest pains that sent him to the hospital. The doctors called it a stress-induced cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, but serious enough for overnight observation. As the ambulance lights flashed across Mr. Clark's indifferent face, something in me snapped. I didn't argue or threaten. I just smiled, went home, and ordered ultrasonic dog repellers. 3 weeks later, Mr. Clark was screaming at my door, demanding to know why his precious babies suddenly refused to leave certain parts of the neighborhood. I can still see them in my mind. 3 muscular Dobermans with cropped ears and docked tails, racing across lawns, terrorizing kids on bikes, sending elderly neighbors back into their homes. Tank, Diesel, and Blade. Even their names sounded like weapons. The first time I encountered them up close was when I moved into the neighborhood 4 years ago. I was unpacking my car when all 3 surrounded me, growling. Mr. Clark strolled over unhurriedly, laughing as I pressed myself against my car door, heart pounding. I learned quickly that animal control had a thick file on these dogs. Mrs. Gonzalez from across the street showed me the scar on her arm from when Blade just wanted to play. The Miller family no longer let their children play in their front yard after Tank chased their 6-year-old up a tree. The HOA had sent multiple violation notices. Nothing changed. Clark's typical response to complaints was dismissive at best. After finding all 3 dogs digging up my newly planted garden, I confronted him about leash laws. He just took a swig from his ever-present Coors Light and suggested I build a fence if I didn't like it. So I did. I installed a 6-foot privacy fence around my backyard, $4,300 I hadn't planned on spending. The next week, Tank somehow got over it and killed my koi fish. When I confronted Clark again, he simply smiled and suggested I needed a taller fence. I tried everything legitimate. Called animal control 6 times, filed 3 police reports, collected signatures from 17 neighbors for a petition, sent certified letters to Clark, spoke at 2 town council meetings. The result? Occasional fines that Clark paid without blinking, treating them like the cost of doing business. Our local animal control office was understaffed and overwhelmed. The police considered it a civil matter, unless someone was seriously injured. Clark knew exactly how to stay just within the bounds of the system. Then came that Wednesday night, updated. Thanks for all the support, everyone. Reading your comments about similar experiences is both validating and infuriating. Several of you asked about Dad's condition. He's stable, but shaken. Has anyone else tried ultrasonic deterrence? Or is there a better solution I'm missing? Dad and I have dinner together every Wednesday. It's our tradition since Mom passed. Nothing fancy, just quality time. That night, we'd walk to Luigino's, the little Italian place 3 blocks from my house. It was a perfect spring evening for the walk home, cherry blossoms starting to bloom. We were 1 block from my house when we heard them, the distinctive sound of nails on pavement, heavy panting. I turned to see all 3 Dobermans racing toward us, no owner in sight. I tried to get Dad behind me, but he stayed at my side. He'd been a high school principal for 30 years and had what he called his disruptive student stance. Feet planted, shoulders back, chin up. What happened next still plays in slow motion when I close my eyes. Tank circled us, growling. Blade darted in from the side, teeth bared. Dad raised his hand defensively, and Diesel lunged. One moment, Dad was standing beside me. The next, he was on the ground with 3 Dobermans circling him, barking frantically. I screamed, swung my purse at them, tried to get between Dad and the dogs. Mr. Clark finally appeared, beer still in hand, looking annoyed rather than concerned. After I shouted at him to call off his dogs, he reluctantly whistled. By then, Dad's face had gone gray. His left arm clutched his chest, his breath coming in short gasps. I was already on the phone with 911. Clark stood over us, his massive frame blocking the streetlight, suggesting Dad was faking it and his dogs were just playing. When I mentioned pressing charges, he scoffed about how running dogs wasn't a crime and good luck proving anything in court. The ambulance arrived 6 minutes later. As the EMTs worked on Dad, a police officer took my statement. Clark kept interrupting with claims about his gentle dogs, suggesting my father had the cardiac event before they even approached. The officer looked skeptical, but didn't arrest. Clark just took photos, information, and promised to file a report. Dad was diagnosed with a stress-induced cardiac event. Not a full heart attack, thankfully, but serious enough to warrant overnight observation. The cardiologist explained that for someone his age, the combination of fear, adrenaline, and the fall could have been much worse. I went home at 1 a.m., exhausted and furious. When I pulled into my driveway, all 3 Dobermans were in my front yard. Clark was nowhere to be seen. They started growling as soon as I opened my car door. That was the moment something fundamental changed in me. Not anger, something colder, more calculated. I closed my car door and reversed back onto the street. I drove to the 24-hour Walmart 20 minutes away and bought pepper spray to get me into my house safely that night. The next morning, I called in sick to work. My research led me to professional-grade ultrasonic dog repellers, devices that emit a high-frequency sound unpleasant to dogs but inaudible to humans. I wasn't sure they'd work, but after exhausting all legitimate options and watching my father taken away in an ambulance, I was desperate enough to try anything. I ordered 6 units for overnight delivery, $900 charged to my emergency credit card. Then I called my friend Marcos, an electrical engineer who owed me a favor. By Saturday night, we had installed 4 weatherproof ultrasonic devices at strategic points around my property, angled outward, with solar panels to keep them charged. We calibrated them to an appropriate frequency, unpleasant for dogs, but not harmful. They had motion sensors with a 25-foot range. Knowing this wouldn't be enough coverage for the neighborhood walking routes, I approached 5 neighbors who had experienced problems with Clark's dogs. After explaining my father's situation, they allowed me to place devices in their yards for testing. I waited, unsure if my desperate plan would work or just become another failed attempt to solve the neighborhood's dog problem. Thursday morning, I was drinking coffee on my porch when I heard Clark's frustrated voice as he tried to coax his dogs out the front door for their morning terrorizing session. I peeked over my fence to see all 3 Dobermans hesitant to step outside, ears flat, clearly uncomfortable. Clark pulled on their collars, but they resisted. After 10 minutes of increasingly creative swearing, he gave up and slammed his door. Same scene repeated that afternoon, and again the next morning. By Saturday, Clark was using leashes, a rare sight, but the dogs still balked when they reached certain areas. They weren't completely housebound as I'd initially hoped, but their territory had shrunk dramatically, creating safe zones throughout the neighborhood. They particularly avoided my property and the main walking routes where I'd placed devices. The following Tuesday, Clark appeared on my doorstep, face flushed with anger. I spoke through the security chain, maintaining distance from his obvious intimidation attempt. He complained that something was wrong with his dogs. They wouldn't leave certain areas and seemed scared. He mentioned taking them to a vet who found nothing physically wrong, costing him $400 for tests. His suspicion was evident as he noted the timing coincided with my father's incident. I maintained plausible deniability, suggesting perhaps his dogs had developed a conscience or karma, had caught up. When he attempted to threaten me, I reminded him of the documentation I had: medical bills, police reports, and 17 witness complaints. The mention of evidence seemed to give him pause, and he left without further confrontation. 3 days later, Clark tried a different approach, catching me at my mailbox with forced politeness. He acknowledged my father's unfortunate incident and mentioned his dogs were suffering, depressed, and not eating well. When I carefully stated I hadn't done anything illegal, he threatened litigation. I pointed out his lack of evidence against me versus my documented proof of his dog's history of aggression. Desperation crept into his demeanor as he offered to pay my father's medical bills in exchange for fixing whatever was happening. I made my position clear. I wanted what everyone in the neighborhood had wanted for years: his dogs properly controlled with leashes and muzzles for the aggressive ones. He balked at the suggestion, arguing about his dog's need for freedom, while ignoring everyone else's right to safety. The next development involved Dr. Ramirez, a local veterinarian who visited me professionally. She explained that Clark had consulted her about his Doberman's sudden anxiety, particularly their reluctance to enter certain areas of the neighborhood. While she couldn't prove my involvement, she expressed concern about potential psychological distress to the animals if ultrasonic devices were being used long-term. I showed her my documentation of the neighborhood's history with Clark's dogs, including my father's medical records. We had a thoughtful discussion about balancing animal welfare with community safety. She acknowledged that properly used deterrence could create boundaries animals learn to avoid without causing permanent harm. Before leaving, she mentioned that Clark was considering legal action, but likely had a weak case given his history of complaints. Updated. The neighborhood dynamics have shifted dramatically since my last update. Several neighbors have quietly thanked me, while others worry about the ethics. Clark's now claiming the devices are damaging his property value. Question: does creating consequences for someone's dangerous behavior make me just as bad as them? Clark's next move was a poorly written legal threat about causing distress to valuable purebred animals and creating a hostile living environment. I consulted with my cousin Rachel, a practicing attorney, who found his claims laughable. Following her advice, I responded with a certified letter containing copies of Dad's $200 in medical expenses, after insurance, plus documentation of prior complaints. I never mentioned ultrasonic devices, just detailed the history of his dog's behavior and consequences. A week of silence followed, then a surprising development. Mrs. Miller texted me about seeing Clark walking his dogs on leashes with muzzles on two of them. It was an unprecedented sight, Clark struggling with three powerful dogs who clearly hadn't been properly leash-trained, while he cursed loud enough for the entire block to hear. The next day, Clark appeared at my door with a defeated look. He agreed to my terms, keeping the dogs leashed and muzzled in public, with behavior training for the aggressive two. His concession wasn't born of moral awakening but rather self-preservation. He'd received a final warning from animal control that one more incident would result in the dog's removal. Someone else had filed a report after my father's incident. I agreed that if I saw consistent improvement, I would see what I could do about their anxiety. When he pushed for an admission of my involvement, I maintained ambiguity while making it clear I could influence whether things improved for his dogs. That evening, I contacted Marcos to recalibrate the devices on my property to a lower setting and narrower range, just enough to discourage the dogs from entering my yard, not enough to create general anxiety. I also coordinated with neighbors to adjust their devices, creating specific boundaries rather than widespread deterrence. The neighborhood transformation was remarkable. Children played outside again. Mrs. Gonzalez resumed her evening walks. Mr. Jimenez returned to his garden without keeping constant watch. Clark's dogs gradually began venturing outside again, though they gave certain areas a wide berth. More surprising was Clark's commitment. The dogs remained leashed and muzzled in public. He even enrolled in a training class with them, something I witnessed firsthand one Saturday morning in the community park. Clark looked uncomfortable among other dog owners but participated nonetheless. The Dobermans were still powerful animals, but they were learning boundaries. Their owner, grudgingly, was too. 3 weeks after our agreement, Clark approached me while I was gardening, noting his dogs still avoided my property despite improvements elsewhere. He requested further reduction of whatever deterrent was in place, acknowledging his compliance with our agreement. I confirmed I'd already decreased the intensity significantly, but wouldn't remove everything until convinced the change was permanent. Our conversation revealed an unexpected insight into consequences. Clark had paid $700 in veterinary bills, plus training costs, while my father's cardiac care totaled $6,200. The parallel wasn't lost on him. For perhaps the first time, he recognized that his negligence had real costs beyond occasional city fines. Word spread through neighborhood channels about the transformation of Clark's previously unleashed terrors. Reactions varied. Most residents, who'd had negative encounters with the dogs, expressed relief and gratitude, while some animal lovers like Mrs. Peterson questioned the ethics of using fear-based deterrence against innocent creatures. I understood both perspectives, feeling occasional guilt about causing the dogs distress, while remembering my father's gray face as he clutched his chest on the pavement. The HOA president, Mr. Abernathy, subtly acknowledged the change during a casual encounter, noting complaints had decreased by 90% and residents felt safe again. He didn't press for details about my involvement, but his knowing look conveyed appreciation. Dad's recovery progressed steadily. When he finally felt strong enough to resume our Wednesday dinner tradition, he insisted on walking despite my concerns, declaring he wouldn't live in fear. As we passed Clark's house, the Dobermans watched from behind the front window, still wary but not displaying their previous aggression. Clark, tending to his yard, acknowledged us with a stiff nod. Over the following weeks, I gradually modified my approach. Working with Marcos, we reduced settings on all devices and removed most of them entirely. I maintained just 2 at low settings, 1 at each end of my property, creating a psychological boundary rather than widespread deterrence. The dogs adjusted, learning specific areas to avoid rather than fearing the entire outdoors. An unexpected development emerged. Clark reluctantly became something of a reference point for responsible pet ownership. New neighbors sought his trainer, recommendations, and established residents asked about handling techniques for their own dogs. His transformation wasn't complete or particularly gracious. He still drank heavily and remained generally antisocial. But his compliance with basic pet ownership standards marked significant improvement. During this period, an unmarked envelope appeared in my mailbox containing a check for $3,100, exactly half my father's medical expenses, with partial settlement on the memo line. No note accompanied it, and neither Clark nor I ever acknowledged the transaction. It wasn't an apology, but it was a tangible recognition of responsibility. A year has passed since those 3 Dobermans terrorized our neighborhood. Dad comes for dinner every Wednesday, walking without fear. Children ride bikes on our streets again. Mrs. Gonzalez's garden won the community award this spring. Life has largely returned to normal. Clark still lives across the street. His dogs remain imposing animals, but they walk properly leashed with a handler who finally understands responsibility. Our relationship isn't friendly. We'll never be friends. But we've established a careful truce built on mutual respect and the knowledge that actions have consequences. I've removed all but one ultrasonic device, which remains at the corner of my property nearest Clark's house. It's set to the lowest effective frequency, creating just enough of a boundary to remind both dogs and owner of our agreement. Perhaps it's unnecessary now, but some lessons benefit from reinforcement. Last week, Clark acknowledged me as he passed my driveway, dogs healing surprisingly well at his side. He remarked on how the neighborhood had changed, and I agreed it was for the better. He admitted, with reluctance, that his dogs were actually better behaved and calmer at home with proper training. I simply observed that training benefits everyone involved. His small, genuine nod of agreement marked how far we'd come from screaming matches and threats. Sometimes I question whether my approach crossed ethical lines. The devices did cause the dogs temporary distress, and using fear as a training tool isn't ideal. But I also remember years of endangerment, injuries, and complaints that went nowhere through official channels. My father in the hospital, Mrs. Gonzalez's scarred arm, children afraid to play outside. Sometimes conventional solutions fail, and unconventional ones become necessary. The ultrasonic deterrents weren't about revenge. They were about establishing boundaries that had been ignored for too long. In the end, everyone benefited. The neighborhood regained safety, my father recovered without further incidents, and even Clark's dogs received proper training and structure instead of running wild until someone was seriously injured or they were forcibly removed by authorities. Updated. Final update. Clark and his dogs just walked past my house without incident. The smallest one even wagged its tail at me. Dad's doing well, teaching the Miller kids woodworking on weekends. This experience taught me sometimes you have to get creative when traditional solutions fail. Would you have taken more drastic measures if it had been your family member who got hurt?